A very good morning to all of you joining us today for a very special session on securing the supply chain and the evolving open source security landscape. So this is a very special session that we've formulated working with Rajesh and Javed. I mean, the trigger for this is largely more or less like we've seen a lot of the growth in the rise of open source and usage of open source, but essentially the attacks that are coming on open source software is also quite significant essentially, and we wanted to deliberate on these and how do you mitigate against some of this. What are some of the supply chain risks that's come your way, and what are some of the potential mitigations, and what are some of the things that you need to keep in mind while you are adopting open source in your context, right? So with that, I want to very warmly welcome Rajesh and Javed Hussain, co-founder and CEO of Lineaje, for this 40 minutes discussion. And I look forward to having a productive discussion with both of you and learn more about essentially securing the open source stack as well as the supply chain stack, right? With that, Rajesh, why don't you just probably in 30 seconds or so, can you help us understand your background, and we'll go with Javed we'll go to Javed, and then from there we'll start the discussion.
Absolutely, Teja.
Rajesh,
Thanks
over
for
to
having
you.
me here. Can you hear me well?
Yes, of course.
All right. So I've been in the industry for almost 2.5 decades, working primarily on engineering and security side. Currently part of Wipro Technologies, specifically Wipro Engineering, building the
Hmm.
product security engineering practice for them.
Hmm.
This topic is very close to my heart, the open source security. We use open source everywhere, and looking forward to the discussion today on this topic.
Okay, thanks, Rajesh. And Javed?
Hey guys, my name is Javed Hasan. I am the co-founder and CEO of Lineage. We started this company 3 years ago, and prior to that, I spent about 25 years in two companies, Symantec and McAfee, twice each. So my background is in cybersecurity, 25 years of building all kinds of cybersecurity products. Uh, in basically any domain in cybersecurity that I have touched it and built products for it. And very excited to be part of this session on software supply chain. We think it's the most important security topic of the day.
Thanks, Javed. I think with that, right, let me start by asking you, Javed, essentially, look, over the last, I think, 3, 5, 7 years, we've seen a sort of like an explosive growth in the open source adoption in different products, right? But we also seen, as we talked earlier, we have also seen a lot of high profile attacks, very potent attacks, I would say, on this stacks, right? So how do you actually summarize the state of open source security as of today? And is it essentially, are we in a crisis mode, or is this like a manageable the evolution that we have seen?
Yeah. So, open source is very, very important. Like you said, we have seen increasing use of it. I mean, we are seeing, on an average, about
Mm-hmm.
70% of all software applications are made out of open source.
Hmm.
And we're even seeing, a modern applications that may be 95, 99% open source. So essentially,
Hmm.
open source is being assembled as part
Hmm.
of application building.
Hmm.
Now, on an average, 70% comes from open source, but at the
Hmm.
same time, 95% of the risk comes from open source.
Hmm.
So essentially, two-thirds of open source is what we call unmaintained or badly maintained, which means it's right. And, in the majority, like I said, 95% of vulnerabilities come from there. And on
Hmm.
top of it, about 7% of all open source is of what we call of dubious origin, which means it is provably
Hmm.
that the package does not come from the source code it claims to have come from. So, so there's significant amount of risks. And in general,
Hmm.
because of that, there's a heavy focus on trying to figure out there's good open source and there's bad open source ultimately. And how do you
Yeah.
separate the two has become really, really important.
Hmm. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So, Uh, my question now is to Rajesh. Rajesh, essentially, we've seen a lot of supply chain attacks that are coming our way, and more often than not, these start with sort of like the dependency on open source software, right? So we saw, I think, one of the recent attacks wherein nation state level threat actor essentially got into a very popular repository on GitHub, and then we were able to thwart it. But that only opens a lot of questions, right? So, what do you think? Essentially, what's fundamentally broken in how organizations assess and manage these risks? Can you help us throw some light?
Absolutely. Let me begin with saying that open source has been a huge enabler of innovation. And if you, as Javed pointed out,
Hmm.
if you look at the percentage of open source components in your technology stack is very very high,
Hmm.
um, and it is a enabler of innovation. At the same time, it is something which is not being developed in house. It is
Hmm.
coming from the open source community. You do not own the code, so there are certain challenges which are associated with the open source uses, and it calls for certain guardrails and safeguards to be in place in order for organizations to be able to safely consume open source components and be able to build safer and faster.
Hmm.
Now if you talk about the challenges, I won't say it is alarming, but it definitely needs a sustained level of focus
Hmm.
and mitigation. How do you make sure you are sourcing from the trusted sources? How do you make sure there is a continuous vulnerability management in place? How do you make sure you're assessing the components to the depth they should be? And what kind of safeguards you can put in place in your
Hmm.
product life cycle to be
Hmm.
able to safely consume and kind of leverage these components available out there.
Hmm.
So in terms of how you really look at the dependencies, one of the key aspects of open source components is when you consume them in your technology stack, you may be only looking at direct dependencies which are directly being sourced
Yeah.
in your applications, but there are a lot of indirect or transitive dependencies which are also part of it,
Yeah.
which need looking at, which
Hmm.
also needs contextualization of what is really being called as part of your runtime, as your when applications are running, and
Hmm.
then really put that in the context of, is this really important for me or not? Okay,
Hmm.
so there is a lot of work which needs to happen in terms of gaining that visibility into
Hmm.
all the dependencies you have and the transitive ones, which ones are important in the context of your environment, and then how do you really mitigate
Hmm.
those issues.
Right. I mean, that's a lot of ground to cover, right? For a lot of, it sounds like a lot of work, right? So, Rajesh, I mean, I'll come to you for for the next question, because I think this is quite important. See, look, every stack, not every stack, I think a lot of quite a large ecosystem. Pieces of software that we engage in India, right? Be it essentially Aadhaar, UPI, or API Setu, or anything else for that matter, has a large part of open source component, if not most part of it being open source, right? So do you think all the organizations in India, especially let's say in critical organizations like CII or BFSS sector, do you think they're adequately addressing these risks that emanate from the open source and supply chain, or do you think the speed of innovation is outpacing the security?
um, I think speed of innovation has been a lot higher than the
Hmm.
security community has been able to catch up on.
Hmm.
There is definitely a lot of progress, lot of awareness in
Hmm.
terms of what needs to be done.
Hmm.
The how part of what needs to be done really needs to be addressed in a holistic manner. And if you
Hmm.
look at the Indian technology sector, BFSI, automotive, healthcare, there has been a lot of awareness. There has been a lot of discussions around what are the challenges, what are the issues which we need to look at.
Hmm.
And there has been concerted effort as well to
Hmm.
address some of that. but I would say we still, a lot of ground to catch up on.
Right. So, Javed, in your visibility, right, how do you see this? The same question, if we have to pose to you, how do you see this applicable in other geographies? Let's say in US as an example, right? So, how do you see the entities in the US are better equipped than let's say BFSI entities in India to deal with the supply chain threats?
Uh, I see awareness being the good thing is we see awareness that we all use open source is very high. Open
Hmm.
source is central to innovation, whether you are a US defense agency or a bank in India, right? It
Hmm.
does not really matter. That's what's driving the innovation. There has been a significant lack of tools that give you full visibility into
Hmm.
what Rajesh is talking about, which is what is the dependency chain of an open source
Hmm. Hmm.
component that you may pull in, right? So that
Right.
can go up to 60 levels deep. The good thing is that company, that's why we started Lineage, that we can give that visibility very easily with modern tools to developers and to
Hmm.
organizations that care. So the good thing is I think we are seeing sort of an equal opportunity globally as
Hmm.
organizations understand that open source is a big part of the innovation, but the other side of this is also a significant part of the risk. So how do you mitigate that risk? Just like in every other industry, right? If you're going to build a car, you can't build a great car without managing the supply chain of the car.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you want to build great software, if 70% of your components come from outside your company, from open source, you
Hmm.
should really pay attention to what you're dragging in and how
Hmm.
good or bad it is. And so modern supply chain tools are really important in that. And we're seeing a global. The good thing is we're seeing global awareness and need and movement towards that.
Hmm. So my next
Yes.
question,
I
yes,
would like to
Rajesh, you
step
want to
in
add something?
there for a minute.
Yes,
So I
please.
think another key difference I see is the regulatory environment as well,
Hmm. Hmm.
in
Hmm.
terms of how you look at it in the rest of the world versus how we look at it in India. There has been a lot of regulatory work and guidelines which is in place
Hmm.
in Europe, US, for example.
Hmm.
We are
Hmm.
also getting there. I think there are certain guidelines in India from CERT, for example, and
Hmm.
your declaring your vulnerabilities.
Yes.
But we have some part to go, and
Hmm.
I think a lot of work which has already happened
Hmm.
in Europe and US can be leveraged here.
Hmm.
So we can have similar guidelines. Actually, look at, because open source is open source. The kind of practices you follow to mitigate those issues is also fairly common, and
Hmm.
we can leverage a lot of work which has happened elsewhere here at our side.
Okay. So I think that's good. You essentially covered more or less my next subsequent questions, but let me ask this to you, right? So essentially, I think this goes to first. We'll go to Rajesh, and then we'll come to Javed. Is essentially the we in India, right? We consume a lot of stack from open source, but a lot of people argue that our contributions are probably not enough, right? So does this essentially take but not give back model, right, increase, do you think, our security risk, and maybe how do you think essentially we as India build a more sovereign control over stack?
Yes. So I think the active contribution to open source community is very, very important. That
Hmm.
is a key baseline for a thriving community, which is not only churning out software components which can be utilized across different use cases, but also making sure there is different problems being addressed in different ways. um, the maintainability of these open source projects, and it's not just about contributing open source
Hmm.
components or open source projects in itself. It is also about contributing fixes, for example, to some
Hmm.
of these projects, contributing
Right.
featurettes to these
Hmm.
projects. And I think there is, if you look at the overall contribution from India, I believe it is very, very low at this point of
Hmm.
time, and we can do a lot more on that front.
Hmm.
Um, it also creates a lot of awareness. in people's mind when they are actually contributing to that community, what the challenges are in maintaining these components. Javed pointed out almost more than half of the open source projects are not well maintained. And what that means is, all these are community-based projects. You're spending your time, putting your efforts, and then providing those, enhancements and fixes. So somebody has to do it. So it has to be a community effort, and I think we need to contribute to this as a part of this, larger global community.
Okay, that's interesting. Javed, my question to you, right? Essentially, because this you mentioned, okay, essentially this goes to 60 steps below, right? Usage of open source in any context. Mm, Often people think a software bill of materials, adopting SBOM is the gold magic bullet that solves all the problems, right? But the adoption of SBOM as a tool probably is still evolving in a lot of industries, right? So, what do you think is an issue here? Do you think that's it's more of a tooling issue, or is it more of an awareness issue, or do you think this fundamentally something deeper that we need to be looking at that acts as a barrier for SBOM adoption in different enterprises?
Yeah. I mean, so SBOM is a recent mandate. As you know, right, in the US, it started with Executive Order 14028 in 2021, which took effect only last year, right? So it's not that long, right? And like Rajesh said, they have been following mandates in Japan, in India, in the Middle East, in Europe. So it's still early days from a mandate perspective. I mean, one of the things I've noticed is that if it's mandated for compliance, then the adoption is fast. If it's just for security hygiene, then the adoption is slow, right? So I think the mandates have the good thing is the mandates are there, and the fact that you should know what in the software you ship, that you build and ship, which is an SBOM, is now required in many verticals and in many things, and the awareness, like the fact that you asked that question means there's high awareness about SBOMs. I think that's the start. The second thing then is SBOM creation. There are a lot of tools, right? So now SBOM, however, now if you have 10,000 SBOMs together, SBOM management, which is now managing those 10,000 bombs and and making sense out of them, applying policies to see where's your risk, that surfaces and so on, is a harder problem. So SBOM managers, have their adoption. So SBOM's creation seems much more widespread than SBOM management at this moment. But we are seeing very strong movement both in India, Indian banking. We are seeing strong movement on SBOM management because of the certain and the SEBI mandates, as well, of course, in U.S. defense, U.S. public sector. We are seeing that, and large financials, and and so on and so forth, automotive. So certain verticals are moving faster than others, right? But in general, it's I can say that 3 years ago, people said, "Oh, okay, what is an SBOM?" And now the question really is, "Hey, you know, what does it take for me to manage hundreds of thousands of SBOMs?" And we
Right.
see the last thing I would say is we see companies that are buying software asking vendors for response, which is a very encouraging sign, right? So third party risk management is also moving into a SBOM world.
Okay, interesting. So, Rajesh, coming to you, right? I mean, all of this looks to be fairly complicated thing to implement at an organization level, right? So, how do you think? I mean, coming from an Indian context, working probably with a lot of SMBs and smaller players, often with shoestring budgets and then limited resources at their disposal, right? So, implementing open source security practices, how do you think they should go about doing those without actually slowing down? This looks to be very scary to adopt any open source, listening to our conversation so far. But with, let's say, if I have to ask you, how will a very small company, and let's say startup or SMB of sorts, with limited resources, how can they adopt without compromising the security?
Sure. I would like to spend a minute on SBOM part, which you asked earlier, Teja. And I see SBOM as an opportunity to, really make your applications more secure.
Hmm.
And the reason I say this is when you're aware of what is in your application,
Hmm.
the ingredients of it, and you know what are the issues on those ingredients,
Hmm.
you are actually more likely to fix them. And it is not only in your view, it is also in your customer's view, because you are supposed to be publishing these as bombs outside
Hmm.
to the users who are consuming your software,
Hmm.
right? So it creates a much larger impact in terms of the urgency to address those issues which are out there, and actually make your application software safer, right? So uh, I think we should use this as an opportunity to do that. And in
Hmm.
terms of your question about how do we do this, how do we make our software more secure in the context of small and medium enterprises, I think we need to keep it very simple. Okay, and there are softwares available out there in the again, open source softwares which are out
Hmm.
there, which can help you implement some of the controls which you need to put in place for a secure development in your development lifecycle without costing you too much and without slowing you down. Okay, so there are a lot of open source packages available which can start with looking at your code scanning, doing
Hmm.
threat modeling for you,
Hmm.
doing code reviews for you.
Hmm.
All of that can be done through open source software. So that's another blessing in disguise, that you don't have to go and look at the commercial softwares to do that for you.
Hmm.
And there are good quality open source softwares available out there which can do that. And I think small and medium enterprises should look at that, leveraging those tools and components out there to help them in the secure development lifecycle.
Okay, so Javed, I mean, just to double click on what Rajesh mentioned, right? So now there are a lot of whole lot of open source tools are there, but nowadays whole, I mean, a lot of developers are just adopting whatever is coming out of Gen AI tools, right? Let's say the explosion of Cursor and Claude and so many other the tools and platforms that are available for to help supposedly programming, right? But one thing that is slightly of a bit of a concern is essentially now all these Gen AI tools, most of the Gen AI tools essentially pulls this open source dependencies automatically, and then more or less they will even tell you what you need to do to install a lot of these dependencies. Oftentimes people just copy paste, right? They
Yeah.
probably don't even see. So do you think we are headed towards sort of like a shadow open source problem? Or what are some of the fixes do you think that people have to adopt when they're, let's say, taking significant help from, let's say, Gen AI tools?
Yeah, so we already had a shadow open source problem, so it's not a new one. I would start there, but if you think of it, right, what's happening with the AI code generators
Hmm.
is code that used to be first party or
Hmm.
developer written is
Hmm.
now become AI written.
Hmm.
So at a very macro level, the transformation that you're seeing is that more and more code is
Hmm.
either open source or AI generated. So
Hmm.
third party code or code from outside your company is
Hmm.
increasing, while code built inside your company is decreasing, right? Because
Hmm.
now AI is writing code, it's nothing other than external code being pulled in. And like you
Hmm.
said, when is writing code, they're also adding new open source dependencies, and you may or may not be aware of them
Hmm.
simply because you're cutting and paste. So essentially, the reuse of open source is increasing dramatically because of AI,
Hmm.
right? So now you're
Okay.
sort of seeing the same problem become bigger and
Hmm.
faster,
Hmm.
right? And so and one of the things is that open source has always been what I call opaque and risky. So now suddenly the opaque and risky code is increasing as a percentage, right? Now we were already in a situation where I know companies that are changing their code a million times a day. So think of it, your SBOM is changing billion times a day,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
dependencies are evolving a million times a day, and you are bringing in code that your developers didn't write and they cannot fix. So
Hmm.
if you think of a relatively large volume issue, now you
Hmm.
have it, right? So what that gets to is now you need a way to source what we call safe and transparent open source packages. So we believe that in like in every other industry, as you sort of think of it, you fix the problem by creating a trusted supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way you fix it is not after the fact scanning, which is where the security industry has been, but by sourcing safe and transparent open source. So essentially, open source itself, if once you bring it in, 19% of an average developer's time is now being spent in fixing open source that they didn't build. And what that does is, and they still can't do it fast enough because of the problem I just raised, right? So in a sense, the security industry is behind the eight ball here. And so the better solution in our point of view is something we call, safe and transparent open source. Let your developers pick from the safe list available from a central repo that will certify it's safe and transparent and meets your organizational policies, as opposed to let them pick randomly. Let's say, it's like a car engineer picking the parts from a garage and then saying, oh, I didn't realize that they were not good enough. That's why you ensure, you put restrictions and say, no, you need to buy from specific suppliers. Similarly, in open source, a transparent, secure supply chain of open source is needed, right? And so there's been a number of companies that have come up with building out or offering enterprises and organizations various flavors of safe and transparent open source.
Okay, so I mean that's a very powerful idea and the concept, right? So Rajesh, Javed just mentioned about transparent and safe open source repositories, right? But like if you look at what's happened in the Middle East recently, and increasingly our critical information infrastructure getting targeted, right? So do you think essentially there's a case for India to adopt or mandate rather critical open source list like US for let's say the software and the hardware that goes into our critical infrastructure? What's your thought?
No, no, absolutely, absolutely. I think uh, applying this SBOM kind of concept on the critical infrastructure is very, very important. Um, and also making sure that we are sourcing these components from trusted repositories. See, we have seen the concept of having vetted base images for a long time, right? You have these different Linux base images available to you which you can consume. They're coming from the trusted sources. What if the same concept can be extended to all open source components? And that in Javed's words, that you are actually getting all your parts from a trusted authorized dealership versus from a roadside garage, right? uh, I think this is a very powerful concept, and how you do that is a thing to think through, and how it can be contributed back to the open source community also is something very important. So creating sources which are trustworthy, and then leaving the grunt work of making sure all those components you're sourcing are safe and secure to that trusted source is very important. It can be done in a community manner as well, which has been done in the past, but then you have to be very aware of which are well maintained repositories, which are not so well maintained repository. And in the pace of innovation which is there, where you actually have features being rolled out almost every day or maybe every hour, it's very, very difficult to keep track of all that. And with the complexity of one dependency sourcing another 10 other dependencies, makes it much more complex.
Okay, so my parting question to both of you, right? So, uh, honestly, listening to our conversation, it feels dealing with this is requires sort of like a dedicated effort and a lot of investment in time and to some degree money and efforts, right? So, what would be one piece of actionable advice that you would give, let's say, for Indian CISOs to future-proof their organizations against open source threats? Rajesh, let's go, or Javed, let's go with you, and then
Like
I'll come
I
to
already started, so let me,
yeah.
Right.
I would say the first step, I would say it's sort of a three-step program.
Yeah.
Step one is you should know what's in your software. You can't really know what's good, what's bad. You can't detect threats. You can't detect risks if
Hmm.
your software is opaque.
Hmm.
And like Rajesh has been emphasizing, S-bombs are the starting point for
Hmm.
knowing what's in any piece of software, whether you build it, whether you buy it.
Okay.
The second thing then is security a bit is in the eyes of the beholder. So,
Hmm.
for example, a commit from China, of course, is fine for China. Some other country may turn around and say, no, that's not my policy. I don't really want Chinese centric code. But
Hmm.
like open source is global with
Yeah.
global contributions, both anonymous and non-anonymous contributions. So that's the second part of it. Know, define what is secure. So know what's in your software. Second, define what is secure. And the third step really is ensure that whatever you bring in
Hmm.
meets your policies.
Hmm.
And there are very multiple modern tools, and like we said, code repositories. We created something called gold open source packages and images
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
will deliver that. But essentially, only source transparent and safe open source components. So those are the three steps in my view.
Okay. That's interesting. Rajesh, what would be your actionable advice for Indian CISOs?
My advice would be, very similar to what Javed said, and one is uh, creating awareness within ourselves, and then creating awareness within our teams. That this is a very very important area to look at. Leveraging the existing tools which are out there. We do not have to reinvent
Hmm.
things. There are a lot of good tools available out there which you can leverage and really get a lot of effectiveness out of that. Third is all of this has to be done in the context of your environment,
Hmm.
and every environment is different.
Hmm.
So instead of going for a one size fits all kind of approach,
Hmm.
you need to really look at what is the real context of my environment,
Hmm.
what does really suit me, what are the risks which are specific to me, and then how do I address them,
Hmm.
with what is available to me. Uh,
Hmm.
I think those will be, few, pointers I would like to say, and
Hmm.
especially in India, as I said, we have a lot of ground to catch up on,
Hmm.
and we should start leveraging a lot of work which is already available out there,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
really make it effective.
Okay. Okay, that's very powerful thought. I think the key takeaway for me is essentially certainly the trusted and transparent open source. That is one powerful idea that Javed has mentioned, and critical open source lists essentially that for something that is going into electronics or CII or anything strategic. That is one powerful idea, and more importantly, despite it's adopting a lot of Gen AI tools, but knowing actually what is important and leveraging already available tools instead of reinventing the wheel, I think would be the way to go. And it's very interesting that essentially Javed mentioned that a million times a day or the SBOM changes or evolves. That's the speed that we'll have to work towards. And I'm happy that the tools already are there that enables this process, right? So thank you so much for both of you for enlightening us with your insights on such an critical and often I dare I say less known aspects of supply chain security, and how do you actually go about defending your enterprise against threats that originate from open source, adoption of open source in your context, right? With that, I think I want to thank all of you for joining today's discussion. I'll leave a quick second for Rajesh and Javed, and then we'll from there we'll go.
Sure. Thanks for having me here, Teja. It was a pleasure. I think we should all increase the uses of open source in our environment, but with the qualifier that it has to be a safe open source.
Yeah, Javed, any parting?
No, thank you, Teja, for the invite and it's been great chatting with both you and Rajesh. right? I mean, this is an exciting domain, and we're excited about what we can do to improve open source.
Sure. So do check out, for people who are joining us virtually, do check out Lineage, Javed, and Rajesh profile in case if see or we you have our coordinates in case if you want to have a further conversation. Please feel free to reach out to us, and then we'll take it from there. Thanks, Rajesh, and thanks, Javed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank